pop up. Welcome, and we're delighted to have everybody here this evening. We know that it is a conflicted evening of events, and we appreciate everybody who is tuning into this webinar and hopefully is recording the convention. For those of you who know people who did not tune in, please tell them that we are live streaming and we are recording, and they can find this program later on our Facebook page. So I am delighted to have our guests here to help celebrate with us the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. It's an occasion that certainly everyone has to recognize, everybody has to mark, but it is just another milestone in a very unfinished journey. And it is not cause for celebration when we are still facing discriminatory policies that affects communities' right to vote, when we are dealing with purges of voter rolls, the latest crisis with the US Post Office, which seems to have been put on hold, although nobody can quite answer what has happened to all of the blue neighborhood boxes that were dismantled and the 700 sorting machines that were dismantled. But faced with that, faced with violations on the Voter Rights Act, faced with discrimination, particularly among communities of color, we hardly have cause to celebrate. We are just marking the centennial of the right to vote, but as women particularly, we have not even begun to achieve equal rights under the law or under the Constitution, even though once again, the ERA has been ratified by the requisite 38 states, but now it is embroiled in all kinds of controversy about deadlines. So the indiscriminate and prejudicial response to gender, to race, to ethnicity is certainly an unresolved issue. We marked the 100th anniversary with all of that in mind. I would like to introduce Sheila Katz, who we are very fortunate to have with us. She is the CEO of our organization, NCJW. She is someone who has, over the course of the past 14 months or so, led this organization on a very, very aggressive advocacy route. And I am delighted to have her here tonight to mark the milestone, but to also recognize the difficult road ahead. Sheila?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sylvia. Good evening, NCJW Arizona. I'm thrilled to be with you tonight. Thank you for inviting me to introduce such a timely, pressing topic. I really just want to build on what Sylvia already shared. As we recognize the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and 100 years of women's suffrage, it is important to recognize how much we have to celebrate. The past 100 years have included important milestones for women, starting with suffrage and ending to today, where we see more women running for elected office and winning, and we're seeing more women leading national organizations, and we're seeing more of us striving ever closer to equity. But as we celebrate this moment, we also have to hold an opposing truth in our hands. It has been 100 years since white women gained suffrage, not all women. On August 18th, 1920, when Tennessee became the last state needed to ratify the amendment, and a few days later, on August 26th, when the amendment was certified, women were finally granted the right to vote on paper. But access to the ballot was effectively denied to nearly everyone except white and often wealthy women. Black women were in most cases not even given a seat at the table. And to this day, their voices are often left out of the most important conversations happening in our country. We must learn from this and do better. Many of these voting barriers remain today for Black or Hispanic communities, Indigenous communities, people with disabilities, and people who don't speak English. As NCJW advocates, we have made it our mission and our responsibility to make sure everyone has access to vote safely, whether in person or through mail-in ballots. NCJW has advocated to expand voting rights since our founder, Hannah G. Solomon, worked alongside Susan B. Anthony. Fast forward to 2020, we hosted our first ever digital lobby day to advocate for expanded voter registration and vote by mail options in every state to make voting both safer and more attainable to everyone in our current public health crisis. We had nearly 800 participants representing 37 states, including Arizona. But we know that there is still so much more work to be done. We're only 77 days away from an election that will change our lives. And we are seeing voter suppression more than ever as we continue to live through the ramifications of this global pandemic. No one should have to choose between their health and their right to perform their civic duty, but that is what's happening all across our country. NCJW's Promote the Vote, Protect the Vote campaign is designed to ensure expanded access to voting and to educate voters in every state of their options to cast a ballot this November. As we continue to live in this warped reality, it is sometimes difficult to see beyond the sadness and oppression of our times. However, as NCJW advocates, we know how important our work is in creating a more just and perfect world. If we sit idly by as voter suppression continues to spread, it could be another 100 years until every vote is rightfully counted. We have the power to create needed change now, and that is what keeps me going. That is what gives me hope. And I hope it does for you as well. In so many ways, this is a milestone anniversary, and we should be proud to follow in the tradition of Jewish women advocating for the right of all people to vote. Thank you to NCJW Arizona for organizing this critical conversation tonight. I urge you to learn from these terrific panelists, Andrea and Joel, and then please do your part to register to vote, to make a plan A, a plan B, and perhaps even a plan C of how you're going to cast your ballot this year, and keep reaching out to your members of Congress to make sure everyone can cast a ballot safely this year. We must continue the unfinished work of the 19th Amendment and honor this day by working to make sure that all people have access to voting. And I guess I'll just conclude and say that your vote is your voice, and it is incumbent on all of us to do everything in our power to ensure every voice is heard in our democracy. So thank you again for having me, for really thinking and activating and mobilizing around voting to make sure you're being as inclusive as we can be to learn from our mistakes and excluding people of color to make sure that we're following people of color in this important moment. And we've got work to do, 77 days. Let's get it going. And with that, I'm gonna pass it back to Sivia.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Well, now that we are all motivated to push ahead and make sure that every vote counts, I'd like to introduce our speakers, our additional speakers. Andrea Miller is the founding board member of the Center for Common Ground and the campaign to reclaim our vote. It is a campaign that was organized by this nonprofit, and the goal of it is to make sure that the turnout among voters of color increases by at least 20% over the 2016 election. In 2020, their focus is on Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, Texas, and Florida. And they have made so far, their volunteers have done over 415,000 calls and sent over 2.8 million postcards. They have aggressive digital campaigns because Andrea is an IT strategist, and they are out there making sure that voices can be heard. I'm also pleased to introduce Joel Edmond, who is the executive director of the Arizona Advocacy Network. Arizona Advocacy Network is one of the most admired, efficient, and dedicated group of trained volunteers who observe voting in Maricopa and Pima counties. Their trained observers help to identify and correct systemic issues with voting machines and improper use of provisional ballots. And their hotline of attorneys advises hundreds of voters on how to protect the right to vote. So they are active on the ground here. Andrea is helping to mobilize in Arizona, among other states, and we are delighted to have both of them here with us. So let me begin with you, Andrea. You are a voter suppression expert. Tell us what is happening that we may not know. What is happening beyond the headlines of the past few weeks about the post office, about the Voting Rights Act being de-emphasized. I mean, the Supreme Court kicked it out and said there was no need for it anymore. Help us understand what we are really up against.
Sylvia, thank you so much. And again, thank you, Arizona, our wonderful organization, the NCJ, National Council of Jewish Women. Thank you. Again, whenever there is an organization of women, we are the ones who go and we do the work and we just stick with it. We power through. So what we're seeing this year, it's pretty much the same as what we see every year. Voters get removed from the rolls for not voting. And when you register to vote, no one gives you that little tidbit of information. If you don't use your ability to vote, you will eventually lose it. So what we're seeing happen in literally states all across the country is secretaries of state's board of elections in August are dumping hundreds of thousands of people from the voter rolls. And most people don't know they've been removed from the voting rolls. And the thing about voting in the United States, very much a privilege, should be a right, but isn't. When you present yourself to vote at your polling place, if you are not registered, you cannot vote a regular ballot. And in most places, they will not allow you to vote at all, especially in the southern states where we work. We also are going to be seeing a huge number of polling location closures. Many this year could be because they just don't have the staff, the people to go in and work the polls. So we have begun a very aggressive campaign to recruit younger poll workers. Now, I live in Virginia, and at my precinct at 66, I'm one of the kids. So we are the generation that is most susceptible. So we would love to see younger people who are less susceptible, more comfortable with the technology, because so many of these states have gone with these brand new high-tech digital machines that are unfortunately more hackable than the old machines they're replacing. So it's going to be an interesting election, but I am filled with hope and excitement and enthusiasm for what I'm seeing all around the South, in Georgia, in North Carolina, in Texas. Voters are saying, you know what? We don't care what you throw at us. It used to be dogs and water cannons. We're going to figure out a way and we're going to make it out and vote. That is what I loved when I watched the election in Georgia. People were like, all right, fine, you're going to make me stand in line for 7 hours. All right, I'll figure it out. I'll just do it. So people are really determined now. They are not going to be denied.
happens if a voter shows up and discovers that their name has been purged?
If they are in North Carolina, they are very, very lucky if they show up during early voting, because North Carolina is one of those states where if you are not registered to vote, you can register and vote same day in North Carolina. The other states where we work, that really is not the case. If you present yourself to vote and you are, I call it deregistered, meaning you used to be registered and now you're not going to be able to cast a ballot, or at least not a ballot that they're going to count.
Joel, let me ask you to bring it home here. What are we facing in Arizona with this? Has there been purging of voters? And explain what is happening on the state level here.
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you all for having me and allowing me to speak to you tonight. And especially knowing my competition, I'm sure I won't be nearly as enthralling as Michelle Obama was last night, but I'll do my best. So thankfully in Arizona, at least we now are well past the deadline for when they're allowed to do, when the counties are allowed to purge the voter rolls. So we shouldn't have any issues with that, between now and November. And I would encourage anybody to go and confirm your registration status at arizona.vote is the best way to make sure you don't end up in this scenario. Because again, our registration deadline isn't until early October. So if you do find that something has happened to your registration, or maybe you've moved, maybe you wanted to update your party registration. A lot of people in Arizona just changed their registration to vote in the presidential preference election in March. If you're an independent, you have to re-register with the party to vote in that election. So you may want to be back an independent if that's the case. Whatever it is, it's always good to update your registration status. But purging has been, in our recent history, has been a real issue in Arizona with removing people from the voter rolls, and which is something that disproportionately affects people of color, affects lower income people, younger people, the populations especially that are moving around a lot. Because the way, at least in Arizona, that you are most likely to be removed or purged from the rolls is because you move and then some election mail goes to your old address before you've updated your registration. And that starts a clock where if you don't then vote in the next couple of elections, you're on the list to be removed from the voting rolls. And so it's people that are moving most often. And we're also a very heavily vote by mail state. If you're moving around a lot, your ballot isn't necessarily catching up with you and following you to the right apartment or whatever the case may be. And so you're just less likely to vote, more likely to miss those couple elections. So purging definitely has disproportionately impacted communities here in Arizona in the past. And there's the one other registration issue I want to touch on that isn't unique to Arizona, but is something that also hits us harder than other states, is that there are challenges with voter registration for addresses or for voters who don't have a traditional address, which is often the case on our rural tribal lands. Most of voters that live on tribal lands outside of our urban counties do not live on a postal road, do not have a traditional address, don't get mail at their house. Which one is also a challenge with voting by mail, but it's a real challenge for how we do voter registration. You have to have an address to be assigned to be put into a precinct, and so counties come up with ways when you do a paper form to figure out how to put you into the system. But our online registration system in Arizona is tied to driver's licenses, and there isn't a way to put in that kind of non-traditional address and actually be able to register online. So if you think about a place like the Navajo Nation right now, the last thing we want to have as the only way for people to register to vote is in person filling out a paper form in front of a canvasser, right? And the opportunity to register on a cell phone would be a much safer option, but right now that's a barrier. It's a structural barrier to registering to vote.
And that's a huge problem in Arizona. I mean, registering the indigenous population, not only because of lack of driver's licenses, but also online registration is limited in so many areas. And particularly what's happening now with COVID up at Four Corners on the Navajo Reservation. So let me ask you this, Adri, because in speaking with some of your team the other day, and they were talking about reaching out to Indigenous voters. What is the strategy for doing that for populations that do not have driver's license, who may not have full access to internet? How do you reach out?
And that gets very, very interesting. What we did in North Carolina, and we are going to do it in all of our target states now. Any area where we know there can be an internet problem, there might be an issue with cell towers and cell phones, we go really, really old-fashioned postcards and billboards.
Okay, so the
So,
old-fashioned methods.
right, we have actually sent 4.1 million postcards so far this year. It was our original plan. It was our goal to send 2.4 million postcards. We left that in the dust a long time ago. So we use the digital billboards whenever we can get them, because it's 20 minutes for a digital billboard to go up. And in states where things change, there's early voting, and then we have to transition to election day voting. There is nothing more perfect than a digital billboard.
What is the greatest problem we are facing now? I mean, as I mentioned earlier, all of us were just beside ourselves with what was happening with the mail. But we also have a Supreme Court that said we no longer need the Voting Rights Act. We have a state like Florida that did pass a law that allowed convicted felons who had served their time to vote. Now they're insisting all fines be paid, which people are comparing to a poll tax. So what is the major focus, or is it everything in aggregate?
We are focused on basically everything we can. Make sure voters who have been deregistered are aware that that has even happened. Give them the information on where they can go to verify what is your voter registration status. If it is anything other than active, contact your county registrar. In states like Georgia, a simple call to the county registrar can take you from inactive, I call that the pre-purge list, to active again. In other states like Virginia, weirdly enough, Virginia will tell inactive voters, you actually need to re-register. So it's all over the place. And voters are very rightly confused. If you've got relatives in another state, you may hear them talking about what their challenges are. And then you go, I've never heard anybody say that about my state. I wonder, is that true in my state? For instance, in North Carolina, they were originally going to require 2 witnesses to your signature for your vote by mail ballot. And so then they made it, well, okay, we only need 1 signature. Many, many states are going to drop boxes so that people can get their vote by mail ballot. They can fill it out, take their time, do that at home, and put it in a drop box. Drop boxes are illegal in North Carolina because when you early vote, or if you drop off your mail-in ballot during early voting, you have to sign. And since they can't have a signature with a drop box, well, they're not going to use them. So it's all over the place. Voters are confused. Should I trust the Postal Service? Shouldn't I? Okay, how soon can I get my ballot? And then I have to send it in right away. What we saw with Georgia was culturally, we saw many community of color voters order their vote by mail ballot, and then the ballot arrived, and then they wouldn't put it in the mail. So one of the big things we had to do with our phone banks and our hotlines is people would call us, I don't have my vote by mail ballot yet. If you get your ballot by this date, you can mail it. Now, if your ballot comes after that date, but during early voting, then you can do this. If your ballot isn't here by this date, we recommend go and early vote. And just having to walk voters through all that is just very difficult. But I believe they said the turnout in the Georgia primary was 4 or 5 times what it had been in 2016. Voters found a way.
And I think that they're seeing that around the country. I know today our Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs, announced that voting in the August 4th primary was up 10% from what it had been, and that I believe she said 88% of the ballots were by mail. So people are energized, and I do think that perhaps all the efforts at voter suppression have in fact created so much outrage and defiance that people are mobilizing. Now, let me ask you this, Joel. In Arizona, we already know that a number of polling places are not going to be opened, and particularly those that had been in schools. How is your team that's on the ground watching voting? What new strategies? How are they going to mobilize?
Absolutely. Yeah, we know in Maricopa County, where I'm sitting, of course, the largest county in the state, we're going to see a pretty large reduction in the number of polling places compared to November 2018. And that's in part, obviously, because of coronavirus. Part of it is because of prior plans before the pandemic. Maricopa County has been undergoing a move to voting centers rather than precinct-based polling places, meaning any voter can go to any of those locations in the county. We have a real issue in Arizona where, if you're assigned to your precinct, and of course precinct lines change, they get reassigned, people oftentimes go to their old place they used to vote instead of the place that they're assigned to vote at now. In Arizona, if you go and vote at the wrong polling place, you're going to vote a provisional ballot, and it's not that, and that kind of provisional ballot does not count. And so that's been a real challenge in the past. And the move to vote centers is in many ways a good thing, but that plus the pandemic has meant a big reduction in the overall number of locations. So we had about 100 locations for the primary in August. I know the county is trying to have significantly more than that for November, but it'll be a drop. Part of that too is strategic, where they're trying to find larger buildings to hold locations so people can be better distanced at the polling place, understanding that we may have people waiting in lines inside, and sometimes in Arizona inside is better than outside, at least for weather, but we know we want people to be able to stay away from each other if you do have to wait in a line. So that's part of it too, is trying to find newer, bigger locations. But I mean, honestly, it's a real challenge as far as people being able to access an in-person voting location. So as far as what we're doing about it, at Arizona Advocacy Network Foundation, we're part of a coalition called Election Protection Arizona. You can check us out at electionprotectionaz.org. There we have a whole bunch of ways where we're monitoring the election, not just on election day, but that whole month before, since so much of our voting is early voting. And so that is volunteers who are willing to be at a polling place, obviously with masks and staying distance from voters, but to be able to help voters who encounter challenges at the polling place. Just this last primary, we had stories from our volunteers where a voter was turned away saying, I showed 2 forms of ID, but the poll worker said I needed 3. And they came out, they said, I thought that wasn't right. And they saw a volunteer who says, I'm with election protection. Did you have any problems? And they were able to talk with the voter and realize, no, that's not right. You had exactly all the ID you needed. The voter went back in. In this case, by the time they got back in, the poll workers realized their mistake and were very apologetic. But that was a voter who may have walked away frustrated without somebody there to validate that, yes, you're right. You are able to vote. And so I think that's a really powerful opportunity for people to participate. Obviously, not everybody is going to be comfortable having any kind of in-person interaction with folks you don't know, and that I completely respect. We also will have people monitoring the polls from your car, driving around with car magnets with our hotline numbers on them. We may send you to 3 or 4 locations to see, is there a line here? Do they have the right signs up? Are people able to access curbside voting? Because all over the state, counties are doing a lot more of what's called curbside voting, where you're able to drive up. They should have a number on a sign. This won't necessarily be at every location, but a lot more than they have been. You can call this number and then poll workers come out and bring you a ballot so you could vote from your car. This has been an option in the past for voters with physical disabilities. Obviously, it's going to be an attractive option for a lot of voters who are voting in person now. So anyway, making sure that all of those systems are up and running. A lot of that you can see from outside of the polling place. So roving poll monitors are really helpful with that. And then simply helping us get the word out, putting up yard signs with the hotline numbers. We've got hotline numbers in English, Spanish, a bunch of different language groups. There's an Asian language hotline number. And then in Arizona, we have a locally run native vote hotline number. And so just getting those numbers out to polling places, out on social media, all of that is tremendously helpful. And you can learn how to be involved with that at electionprotectionaz.org.
I would like to tell everybody that we are happy to take questions if you will type on the Q&A portion of the Zoom webinar. We're very happy to take them. There is one, which is for our Arizona primary. The question is, there was about 50% voting. I think it was actually 36 I heard today. The questionnaire says, that's not great. Was it affected by suppression or a lack of interest?
I could take a crack at that. I think it's a combination of things. It's a combination of systemic oppression. I mean, you asked Silvio, what is our greatest challenge? Is it the post office? Is it John Roberts in the Supreme Court? Is it this complicated voting system that we have to make sure to get registered, make sure you stay registered, all that stuff? And the answer is yes, all of it, but it's the root cause of all of that, which I really appreciated you recognizing and your language around marking the anniversary here. Because of course the 19th Amendment, an incredible milestone, didn't undo white supremacy, which is, so it enfranchised some white women, right? But we in Arizona, our history of voter suppression runs very deep. It wasn't until 1948 when we had a Supreme Court decision in Arizona that enfranchised Native Arizonans. That was 24 years after Congress had declared them citizens, centuries after they had the right, should have had the right to vote. That wasn't until the 40s. Many Spanish speakers, Native voters who are monolingual, practically did not have the right to vote until 1975, guaranteeing the right, when Congress amended the Voting Rights Act to guarantee language access. So a lot of this is a centuries old problem. And I think the challenge that we have to, the way we have to think about this has to shift from sort of what is the next reform, what is the next barrier to take down, to changing the whole way we think about voting. The burden should not be on the voter to figure out how to jump through all the hoops, know when all the things are happening, know what websites to go on to make sure you're still registered to vote, right? If you're eligible to vote in this country, you should be able to vote, right? Why we need policies like same-day registration, like you're talking about, Andrea, like automatic voter registration. We got to think a lot bolder in terms of how to fix our democracy and build a genuine democracy. Anyway, so I realized I got a little off, but so part of it though is just it's the reality that there's a lack in part of participation because there's a system that for many people just, it does not reflect their needs, right? Even if you are able to jump through all of the hoops and vote, we have a Congress right now that is sort of inactive in the face of a global pandemic when people are suffering, right? People are getting sick and losing their jobs, and so part of it, I think, is a cynicism, but it's a cynicism that's taught, right? But that all comes back to the fact that not everybody's actually able to vote. Not everyone is in fact represented by elected officials.
I would like to point out that we have a comment that's from somebody watching this webinar who says it's not necessary to have a home address. Homeless shelters and other entities allow homeless to use their address, and that's acceptable. So I think we need to make that clear, because people may be put off by the fact that they do not have a residence.
Yeah, I think I may have caused that confusion, because that is correct, and I appreciate the clarification. I was talking specifically about our online voter registration system in Arizona, servicearizona.com.
Okay.
There isn't a way to enter a non-traditional address and actually get registered that way. You can, but using a paper registration form, and that's how a lot of folks who are experiencing homelessness or for whatever other reason don't have a traditional address are able to vote, and making sure everybody knows you do have the right to vote. That is really important, so thank you.
Good. We have another question, which is, tell us about the permanent early voting list, PEVL, and when are PEVL ballots dropped?
Thank you. PEVL is one of our greatest things in Arizona. One of the few structures that we've made that is very pro-voter. We passed it, our legislature did back in 2007. And so it's a way it's a way that you can sign up to receive a ballot in the mail for every election that you're eligible to vote in. So you don't have to bother to go and request one every single time. It's going to show up. It, for me, is often a reminder that, oh, there's a local election coming up that I may have forgotten about. Anyway, so those ballots will go out. Early voting starts 28 days before the election, just after the registration deadline. And so those ballots are going to go out in the mail in early October. You can, again, on arizona.vote, learn about tracking the status of your ballot. In Maricopa County here, we've got a great tool where you can get texts and emails letting you know when your ballot has been sent out. And then again, once you've sent it back to them, when it's been received and when it's been counted. So I'd encourage folks to learn about signing up for those tools.
There's another question, given the polarization and politicization of mask wearing, and we have seen many confrontations in retail outlets, commercial businesses. Question is, will voters be required to wear a mask to enter the voting area? In the primary, I was faced with a non-masked voter who was even walking against the marked traffic flow direction at the polling place. Who will be monitoring that? Will people like your teams that are out there monitoring what is happening at polling locations? Would you then call that in? I know that the sheriff's office has a hotline where you can report people who are not wearing masks in public places. Would that apply to the polling booth?
Thank you. I can just start with what we know about Arizona, which is, this is something we've been monitoring, and various counties are treating this differently, right? This is a reminder that our elections are fundamentally run at the local level in America. Coconino County up north, where Flagstaff and Northern Arizona University are, they will be requiring masks in polling places and will be offering masks to voters who don't have them. And if you refuse, then they will be doing curbside voting outside the polling place for those voters. To my knowledge, there is not another county in the state that has that policy. Even in counties that do have a countywide mask ordinance, like Maricopa County, for example, voters will be encouraged to wear masks. But yeah, we're very cognizant that there will likely be people who will show up not wearing masks. We saw that in the primary, and that is one of the things that we would have people out looking for. and reporting into our command center so we can figure out what would be the best approach to that. And those are conversations we're having with counties right now as to how to handle those issues on election day. As far as calling the sheriff's office or other law enforcement, that's something that actually on election day we're typically pretty wary of, because law enforcement showing up at a polling place can also be intimidating to voters, right, especially, from communities of color who, in a place like Maricopa County, where we had a sheriff's department that, had such a long history of harming Latino communities. That's been something we really wanted to shy away from in the past in Arizona, but it is a real challenge. And again, another reason to vote by mail. If you do need to go in person, take your early ballot, just drop it off. You can go in and out, don't show ID, skip the line, and don't have to worry about the anti-maskers.
Andrea, I want to ask you, we have one comment, and unfortunately this plays into the opposition, those who would criticize mail-in ballots, but it comes from somebody who says, my daughter hasn't lived in Arizona for 20 years. How can I stop political mail-in ballots from coming?
Well, you can contact the county registrar, because at that level, that is really where the ballot is going to originate. Now, political mail is something different. That's coming from political campaigns. And what a lot of people don't understand is political campaigns, they buy access to a tool that allows them to, quote, view the voter file and then do voter contact. What people often don't understand is that there are no live real-time updates to what candidates and campaigns have. So we were very soundly criticized, and I was investigated by the North Carolina State Board of Elections when some people received our postcards asking them to check their voter registration, and they were actually deceased. So one of the things that happens is when someone is deceased, the Board of Elections is not one of the immediate places that the family makes sure they get notified that this person is deceased. So it may be weeks, months, and occasionally years before that hits the county registrar, and then it will be weeks, if not months, before the voter tools actually get that change.
Right. I mean, and so many of the organizations buy lists, and lists that are exchanged are often so outdated. I mean, we, I'm sure, have all gotten phone calls soliciting charitable contributions, and they ask for an individual, a relative who may have been deceased for 15 years. So the updates are very difficult. But we have another question, which is, Andrea, what about, is in Arizona, we're allowed to take ballots for others and bring them to the drop boxes or the polling places. What about ballot so-called harvesting in other states?
Oh, well, North Carolina had to redo a congressional election in 2019.
Right.
So when they rewrote the North Carolina law, they went way too far in the other direction, saying only a voter or a close family member or someone legally authorized by the voter could even ask for a vote by mail ballot for the voter. And they had the same rules for dropping off the ballot. So it varies wildly. Georgia is very similar, saying that if you're going to drop off ballots, it can be your ballot or it can be family members, and they really narrowly define what a family member is. And then you have other states where They haven't had a problem. For instance, in Virginia, we have no such rules because normally only 3% of Virginia votes by mail. So it's never really been an issue.
But that likely will change in this election.
It could very well change, yes.
And in Arizona, this has obviously been a topic of some contention here. I would argue because it was a primary tool used by largely Latino-led and Latino-focused civic engagement groups to collect ballots at doors, that the state legislature, came back and banned it. In fact, that's not just my opinion, that's the opinion of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that also struck down that law, but that ruling has been put on hold, and the Supreme Court, we're waiting to hear news from them as to what they're going to do with the case. So as of right now, we still have a similar rule to what Andrea was talking about. It is a felony to turn in someone else's ballot unless you're a family member, a caregiver. It's a pretty narrowly defined set of people. But if you do have a family member who you live with, there are folks who are able to turn in early ballots. And an important thing to know is if you are bringing in, spouses or kids or whatever, close family member that lives in your household, bringing in their ballot, no poll worker is going to ask you whose ballot is that. They have all been very clear. We're not going to be questioning voters who are bringing in early ballots to drop them off. But it is a serious impediment here. It's something that I know, nobody who's doing, get out the vote effort is going to have people collecting ballots because of the threat of being prosecuted as long as that law is in effect. So we're waiting to see if we get some news from the Supreme Court before the election.
And that also confuses voters because they hear about the pending lawsuits and they don't necessarily hear what the final resolution was. In Texas, can everybody vote by mail because of COVID-19? No, yes, no, yes. It was like, well, it depends on what week we're in.
So
Exactly,
true.
exactly. What states do you anticipate are going to be the most problematic? We saw the nightmare scenarios in Wisconsin, for example, and Georgia during the primaries.
And Kentucky, one polling location in the city of Lexington.
Exactly, exactly. So how is that going to be resolved in the election November 3rd? Have there been injunctions? Have there been lawsuits? Have there been case filings to try to prevent areas from closing polling places?
The problem with closing polling places is really going to rest, or the excuse will be that they were not able to maintain the staffing level necessary to open the polling place. This is what we saw in Georgia. A number of polling places didn't open because the people who were scheduled to be the opening staff just didn't show up, or people missed the notation that, I've decided, no, I just can't do that because I'm really concerned about the risk of COVID. So most websites that say this is where the vote locations are going to be all immediately put up a disclaimer: the polling locations could change at any minute, so keep checking back. And what always concerns me when I'm dealing with vote centers especially is that we work with a lot of older voters who may be rural, who don't have internet and or don't use computers, which can also be true of voters who are poor. So that is why we have gone to billboards in rural areas where we put up a phone number. Most people can manage a phone. And so we build a lot of bots. We build them so that older people can call them. And when they call the bot, they need to give their county and their zip code, and the bot will say, this is your closest polling location. We will have a team of young people scouring websites on the phone with county election officials. We will be watching our mapping tool, see something, say something, for polling location closures, at which point we can immediately remove one from our tool or just write, this one is closed.
Oh, that's incredible to be able to have that kind of quick response as people don't show, poll workers don't show up. Suddenly there are centers that are shut down that people had no clue were not going to be operative. Let me ask this question. We've been talking willful voter suppression. What about voting security, which is also a way of suppressing the vote, certainly, making sure that votes do not count? What kind of protections, if possible, are anticipated? Or what are we going to do to combat that?
One concern that we have is from not only the disability community, but senior community, and we're even seeing these sort of interesting behaviors among very young people with the signature matching. For people who have disabilities, especially if it's any type of tremor, palsy type disability, their
Right.
signature is never the same. If you're going, oh, the signature must be exact. I've had people say, I can sign my name 5 times, and every time it will be
Different.
slightly different. So we have the false security measures as opposed to always the concern when you're dealing with electronic equipment, are those machines on the internet?
Right. Have there, given some of the concerns about electronic tampering and outside interference, have more jurisdictions gone back to paper ballots? Are we seeing any of that?
No,
Not at
No.
all?
not in the
Thankfully,
South.
yeah, I was going to say, thankfully in Arizona, we've been a paper ballot state forever. But yeah, I mean, that's a real problem in the South.
Right.
That's a big concern.
Yes, I mean, we sued the state of North Carolina. I think everybody knows John Brakey's name, where he made a presentation to the people selecting the equipment about the inherent problems with the equipment they were looking at. And they chose it anyway. So we sued. We explained, you're looking at a machine that is more hackable than the old machine you're replacing it with. And you're spending 3 times the cost of what we recommended. A piece of paper and a digital scanner. Paper, pen, scan.
Right. Exactly. Well, let me ask this. In Arizona, there has been, and elsewhere, but there have always been questions, how late will ballots be counted? How long after election day? And that is particularly a concern now with fears of mail inefficiency, albeit LaJoy said that he is going to stop at the moment, but we all know damage has been done. What is the time frame? Has it been extended in some states? Some cases I know it's a 3-day window. In other states it may be however long it takes to count the ballots, which of course is the Oval Office's concern that it could drag on and on.
Of course.
Tell us about this, about how long for eligibility.
Well, if you were, so one, for eligibility, the rule is in Arizona, is it arrives in the hands of your county election office by 7 o'clock on election day. So that means you voted on election day, you put it in the ballot and it showed up in the mail by election day. However you get it, you put it in a drop box by election day, however you get it there, but it has to be received in hand by election day. Now, this is something that is being fought over and challenged all over the country. And I think some of the states that are moving to a postmark by election day, especially given the pandemic right now, and access to mail is a tremendous idea, but that is not where we are in Arizona. Right now, it has to arrive by 7 p.m. on election day. If it does, there are no problems with it. We talked about signature issues. We thankfully, here, voting rights advocates have fought for a good curing process for signatures. It's not perfect, but you have the opportunity and counties have the obligation to call, contact voters and check out, confirm that they're the voter who voted that ballot if they have a signature issue. And that's why it's so important to not just sign, but put your phone number on the ballot envelope so that they have a number to call for those issues. But again, assuming your ballot is all set to be counted, it arrives in the office by 7 p.m. on election day, it will count, no matter if it's the day after election day or 10 days after election day. And in Arizona, especially if you are following our close US Senate race, Secretary of State race, Superintendent race in 2018, and some others, some of those races were decided many days after election day.
Correct.
That was a preview for 2020. A lot of races in a lot of states, I think, will not be able to be called on election night. That's something, that's not totally uncommon for us in Arizona. California, it's completely normal. And it's a part of having a lot of vote by mail. I think, we can have our election results immediately, or we can count everybody's ballot. And I certainly prefer the latter.
Okay.
Yes.
We have another question. Arizona has prepaid envelopes. Do they get postmarked? What happens if it's dropped off at a ballot drop box and there's no postmark?
Great question. And thank you for that. So yes, we don't have the postmarks. There's a barcode on the bottom. And I know each of the counties has a different solution for how they have that scanned with the Dropbox. But in any of the drop boxes that are up in Arizona, you should be able to put them in there before 7 p.m. on election day. But yeah, it's not technically a postmark. Good call.
We only have a few more minutes left. So I would like to ask first, Andrea, from your perspective, what can all of us do? Most of us are armchair activists here during this time, but what can we do? Talk about your organization and how people might be able to help get out the vote for underrepresented communities.
We work to make sure that communities of low information voters receive information in a manner that they will be able to digest. So that's why I said we use postcards. We write it down, and our postcards are county specific. So if there's a website, we will give a website, and then there is normally the county registrar's phone number. And we have a lot of quality control on our team. So before we release a script, someone is going to call that phone number and make sure that someone answers on the other end with a department that sounds like it has something to do with voting. Some counties, elections kind of go through the tax assessor's office. That doesn't sound like voting. So they ask around and try to get that direct number. When we build bots, most of our big statewide bots are, you can call it, you can text it. If you call it, it talks to you. If you text it, it texts back. To be able to reach those older voters who all they've got is a phone, and then to keep the younger voters from losing interest because they're having a lifelong love affair with their phone.
Well, I would like to add that NCJW Arizona has been talking to Andrea's staff, and we are hoping to be able to have texting and phone banking training sessions. If you are interested, please reach out to Carol Consalvo, and you can sign up, reach out to any of us, and we can put you on our Get Out the Vote task force. Joel, very briefly, how can people sign up to be part of election protection and monitor what's going on?
Absolutely. So Election Protection AZ is where you can sign up for our emails, learn all those hotline numbers to share with friends and family, post on social media, and to learn how you can volunteer with us on election day and beforehand. And again, that can be somebody who's comfortable talking with voters outside of a polling place. It can be in your car, it can be entirely at home. There are a lot of different ways to get engaged with that at electionprotectionaz.org. And the only other pitch I would make is, again, to check out arizona.vote, confirm your registration status, find where you're supposed to vote if you're going to vote in person. And there's a bunch of great other voting info on there too.
Thank you. Thank you both. And again, I thank Sheila, who did cut out a little earlier, a minute or so ago. This was so important, given the milestone of today, given the serious issues that we continue to face. As Sheila put it so well, your vote is your voice. We have been saying that over and over and over again. So please remember to get in your ballots, to sign up for early voting, but beyond that, to please work with groups like Reclaim Our Vote and Election Protection so that we can prevent voter suppression and we can make sure that every vote counts in this election, which is probably one of the most crucial we have ever faced. Again, thank you all very much, and thank you to our panelists. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Take care.